Chapter 1: The House in the Woods. The air was filled with the scent of fresh pine as the four friends finally reached their temporary sanctuary deep within the coniferous forest. Their long-awaited break after college promised to be extraordinary. They had rented a cozy cabin made of carved wood, nestled among centuries-old trees. The cabin turned out to be even more beautiful than they had imagined. Its walls, made of thick logs, were adorned with intricate carvings depicting motifs of the forest pine branches, berries, and wild animals. The roof was covered with pine cones that softly rustled underfoot, reminding them they were in the heart of nature. "This is what I call a perfect retreat," exclaimed Emily, shrugging off her backpack. Her delight was shared by the others, Max, Dan, and Kate. They looked around, breathing in the fresh air and relishing the tranquility of the forest. Meanwhile, the cabin was being handed over to them by its owner, a peculiar woman named Clara. Upon arrival, they noticed that her appearance was somewhat unusual: dark eyes, almost expressionless, and strange pigmented spots on her skin, as if sunburnt from an unknown light source. However, her smile was friendly, and she warmly welcomed them. "Welcome, my dear," she cheerfully greeted them, showing them into the house. The friends exchanged glances but decided that Clara's appearance was just a minor eccentricity, not too important compared to the beauty of the place they had chosen for their vacation. The first day of their retreat unfolded with a serene rhythm as the four friends settled into their woodland cabin. After the initial excitement of exploring the exterior, they turned their attention to unpacking and settling in. The interior of the cabin was just as charming as its exterior. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting warm patterns on the wooden floors. The main living area featured a rustic fireplace, adorned with local art depicting scenes of wildlife and forest landscapes. Cozy armchairs surrounded a sturdy wooden table, inviting them to relax and unwind. Max took charge of organizing their belongings, while Emily and Kate inspected the kitchen. Dan, always the curious one, wandered around examining the intricate carvings on the walls and the patterns of light filtering through the curtains. As they unpacked, they began to notice subtle peculiarities about the cabin. The carvings on the walls seemed to subtly shift when they weren't looking directly at them. The air inside felt unusually still, almost as if time itself had slowed down in this secluded corner of the forest. Emily, standing by the window, suddenly felt a shiver run down her spine. She turned to see Kate staring intently at an old painting hanging above the fireplace. The painting depicted a serene forest scene, but there was something unsettling about the eyes of the animals portrayed within it. They seemed to follow her every move. Meanwhile, Max and Dan exchanged puzzled glances as they noticed small, unexplained drafts of cold air that seemed to come from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. As the afternoon turned into evening, the friends gathered around the fireplace, savoring a simple meal they had prepared together. The crackling of the fire provided a comforting backdrop to their conversation, yet each of them couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched, not by Clara, but by something else, something elusive and intangible. Later that night, as they retired to their respective bedrooms, the strangeness of the cabin became more palpable. Dan, lying awake in bed, could have sworn he heard faint whispers echoing through the walls, whispering words he couldn't quite make out. Kate, on the other hand, felt an inexplicable heaviness in the air, as if the very atmosphere of the cabin was laden with unseen energy. Emily, in her room, stared at the ceiling, unable to shake off the sensation of being watched. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing there, but the glass only reflected the moonlight filtering through the trees outside. Outside, the forest whispered its own secrets, the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl adding to the eerie ambience of the night. Their first day in the cabin had been filled with beauty and mystery, setting the stage for what promised to be an unforgettable retreat. Little did they know, however, that their journey into the heart of the forest would lead them deeper into a world where reality and imagination intertwined in unexpected ways. The morning of the second day welcomed the friends with soft sunlight filtering through the forest canopy outside the cabin windows. Emily, Max, and Kate had already gathered at the table, having breakfast and discussing the events of the previous night. Dan, who entered the room abruptly, greeted them with a sleepy smile and joined them. "Guys, I can't not tell you about what happened last night," Dan began, sitting down at the table. His voice trembled slightly, and his gaze betrayed his concern. Emily, Max, and Kate exchanged glances, feeling a chill run down their spines. "What happened?" Kate asked, her voice filled with apprehension. "I couldn't fall asleep easily," Dan continued, his hands shaking as he recalled the events. "And suddenly I heard rustling outside the window. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe some animal. But the rustling grew louder, and I felt like someone was standing by the window." Emily, Max, and Kate gasped softly. "And then what did you do?" Max inquired, trying to keep the unease out of his voice. "I got up and went to the window to look," Dan went on, his hands visibly trembling now. "But when I peeked out, there was no one there, just twilight shadows and leaves rustling in the wind." Kate covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with disbelief. "That's scary," she whispered, nervously glancing at her friends. "Dan, maybe it was just a dream," Emily suggested, though uncertainty tinged her voice. Dan shook his head. "I wish I could think it was just my imagination, but there was something so real about it, like it was alive." Max quietly poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands also shaking slightly. "Maybe we should go talk to Clara and ask her what she knows about this place," he suggested, attempting to restore a sense of calm. The three friends nodded in agreement. They felt that something unknown and mystical lurked within this secluded forest cabin, and now their curiosity was tinged with fear. "Let's go right now," Kate said decisively, and they all got up from the table and headed towards the door. And so began their investigation into the dark corners of the house and their own souls. The four friends approached Clara's room with a sense of unease, filled with questions about the events of the previous night and the strange occurrences in the forest retreat. Emily softly knocked on the door. "Clara, can we talk to you?" she asked, but there was no response. The friends exchanged worried glances as Max cautiously opened the door. The room was empty, as if no one had stepped foot in there for a long time. The air carried a faint scent of wood and antiquity. The bed was neatly made, but a thin layer of dust settled on the furniture, and the books on the shelf seemed untouched. "This is strange. Where could she be?" whispered Kate, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of Clara's presence. "Maybe she's outside," Dan suggested, stepping out onto the veranda. However, their search in the yard proved fruitless. Clara was nowhere to be seen, and there were no traces of her presence. As time passed, their concern grew. "Perhaps she had some errands to run," Emily suggested tentatively, her voice lacking conviction. Max surveyed the surroundings more carefully. "It doesn't make sense for her to just disappear like this. We saw her just last night, and she seemed fine." Kate approached the table and picked up a photograph hanging on the wall. It depicted Clara, smiling, surrounded by her family. "Look at this. It's her family photo. She must be somewhere around here." They searched every corner of the house, but found neither Clara nor any clues indicating she had lived there. Tension mounted among the friends, their worry escalating with each passing minute. "What do we do now?" Dan asked, staring into Clara's empty room, his voice tinged with helplessness. Emily nodded, her gaze downcast. "I don't know. But we need to do something. We can't just stay here in the dark." Their search had only just begun, and each of them realized that there was much more to this secluded forest retreat than they had initially thought. The friends gathered around the table, peering at their plates of food, but their minds were far from their meal. The air in the room was tense and uncertain. "Maybe she just went away for a few days," Emily suggested, her concern evident in her voice. "We don't know much about her life outside of this place." Max nodded, stirring the remnants of soup in his bowl with his spoon. "Possibly, but something tells me that doesn't explain all the odd things we've noticed." "Yeah, how do you explain the rustling and shadows?" Dan heard, added Kate, her eyes flashing with nervous tension. "It's more than just the host being absent for a couple of days." Dan quietly poured himself some water, his expression thoughtful. "I think we should go through the house again. Maybe we missed something, some clues or hints. Or maybe we should ask around with the neighbors or locals," Emily suggested, glancing around at her friends for approval. Max scratched his head thoughtfully. "We could try, though I'm not sure they'd know more than we do. Still worth a shot. Maybe we have some evidence that we didn't notice at first glance," Dan wondered aloud, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "We could go through the rooms again and take a closer look at everything," Kate proposed. "Maybe we'll find something that will help us understand what's going on." The conversation continued, their thoughts and ideas weaving together in search of answers. They all felt that something unknown enveloped this house and their own souls. Deciding to conduct another search of Clara's room, the friends entered once more into the cozy space, now devoid of its inhabitant. The room was filled with light filtering through vintage curtains, and the scent of antiquity hung in the air, reminiscent of a time when the rural home was in full bloom. Clara had a passion for history, evident in every item within her sanctuary, from vintage books on the shelf to antique decorations on the table. "Look at all these amazing things she has here," remarked Emily, studying the vintage photographs on the wall intently. She was really into history. Max carefully picked up one of the books from the shelf and flipped through its pages. "Yeah, there's so much interesting stuff here. Maybe something could give us a clue about what's going on." Dan, scanning the room intently, sat down and began meticulously checking every corner. "I feel like she kept something important here. Maybe something that could explain all these strange sounds and sensations." Kate slowly walked towards the rug in the middle of the room. What if something is hidden under this rug? She bent down to lift the edge of the rug, and suddenly her fingers felt something uneven. "Wait, I think I found something," exclaimed Kate, and the others quickly gathered around her. Together, they lifted the rug to reveal an old wooden trapdoor underneath, which appeared as though it hadn't been opened in a long time. The friends exchanged looks filled with surprise and anticipation. What could this be? Max pondered aloud, lowering his gaze into the opening. "There's only one way to find out," said Dan decisively, stepping towards the trapdoor and lifting it. Opening the old trapdoor, the friends found a rickety staircase leading down into a dark and dusty basement. They descended cautiously, feeling the creaky wooden structure under their weight. At the bottom, they discovered a small cellar illuminated only by the flickering light of a lantern Max had brought along. The walls were made of old stone, and the air carried a scent of antiquity and dampness. Dusty boxes and old items were scattered on the floor, accumulated over many years. "Look at this," whispered Kate, pointing to a corner of the cellar. There stood a massive ancient tombstone, tall and adorned with numerous incomprehensible runes and symbols. It seemed to have been here for eternity, like a guardian of ancient secrets. "What is this stone?" Dan asked, approaching closer and scrutinizing the markings on it. The runes look like they hold some special meaning. Max illuminated the inscriptions with the lantern, trying to decipher something. "Yes, they appear to be runes, but I can't make out their significance. Who could have left such ancient inscriptions here?" "Maybe Clara knew something about this," Emily suggested, leaning towards a nearby crate and starting to inspect it. Kate suddenly stopped, her gaze fixed on the tombstone. "Why don't we try to decipher these symbols? Perhaps they will tell us something about what's happening here." They continued exploring the basement, each step bringing them closer to new mysteries and questions. Amidst the old belongings and dust, they felt they were approaching something greater than just the disappearance of their host. Chapter 2: Reflections by the Fireplace. After thoroughly searching the basement and finding no new clues or hints, the friends returned to the main floor of the mansion. Max carefully lit a fire in the fireplace, quickly filling the room with comforting warmth and light. They settled into comfortable armchairs around the fireplace, each lost in their thoughts and impressions of what had transpired. Kate, sitting closest to the fireplace, gazed into the flames flickering playfully on the logs. Her mind was filled with questions about the tombstone and the mysterious symbols they had discovered in the basement. "I think those runes on the stone are the key to unraveling this mystery. We need to figure out what they mean. Perhaps they are connected to the history of this place or Clara's fate." Emily, slowly running her hand through her hair, responded, "Yes, perhaps, but how do we decipher them? They look so ancient and unusual." Max, focused and serious, added, "I think we should revisit Clara's books and antique items. Maybe we'll find something that will help us make sense of this puzzle. Who knows what else might be hidden in this house?" Dan, who had been silently sitting among his friends, suddenly stood up and walked over to a table where old maps and documents were laid out. He began examining each document closely, as if hoping to find something crucial. "Maybe Clara had records or diaries that could give us a clue. We need to keep searching." The conversation flowed quietly and slowly, as if each of them was trying to piece together parts of a puzzle to understand the bigger picture. Occasionally, someone would introduce a new idea or speculation, and together they would analyze each possibility. Kate returned to thoughts of the tombstone. If we can decode these runes, maybe we can find answers to all our questions. That should be our top priority. Max nodded in agreement. Yes, but we'll need tools or knowledge. Perhaps we can reach out to an expert in ancient scripts or an archaeologist. Emily sighed. We can't stay here forever. We need to act quickly. Their conversation was filled with determination and a desire to uncover the mystery that shrouded this house and their host's disappearance. The fire in the fireplace burned slowly, casting light on their faces, where shadows of uncertainty and resolve danced together. After long deliberations and discussions by the fireplace, the friends finally reached a consensus on their next steps. The fire in the fireplace burned slowly, casting light on their gathered faces, filled with determination and hope. I think we should focus on deciphering these runes on the tombstone, suggested Kate, returning to the central theme of their discussions. Yes, that's our top priority, agreed Max. But we'll need help. I think we should reach out to a specialist in ancient scripts or an archaeologist. I can try contacting professionals from the university who might assist us with interpreting the runes, offered Emily, pulling out her phone. They might be interested in such research. Dan, still sorting through documents on the table, looked up. What about the archive in that town you mentioned? Maybe we can find something useful there. Yes, that sounds like a great idea, Kate agreed. We might uncover historical documents or records there that could provide key information. All right, let's do that, decided Max, standing up from his chair. Tomorrow morning we'll head to that town and visit the archive. I think it's our best chance to uncover all the secrets of this place. Everyone nodded in agreement, feeling that they finally had a clear plan of action. They continued discussing details, which documents they needed to find, what questions to ask at the archive, and what expert opinions they would require. As the night slowly passed outside the mansion windows, the friends felt that each step brought them closer to unraveling the mystery that had plagued them for so long. After finalizing their plan for the next day, the friends parted ways and headed to their respective rooms to rest. Each of them lay down in their beds and began to contemplate the events, expressing their unique perspectives on the situation. Kate sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window where the trees rustled softly. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of the mysterious runes on the tombstone. She felt that the key to unraveling this mystery lay within those ancient symbols. Her determination and persistence reflected in her eyes. She was not going to back down until she found answers. Max, lying on his back with closed eyes, pondered the next step seriously. His mind worked like a machine, analyzing every detail and potential outcome. He felt the weight of responsibility for the safety and success of the mission to uncover the secrets of the house. Plans were already forming in his mind for interacting with the archive and experts. Emily, sitting at her desk in her room with her phone in hand, scrolled through potential contacts of scholars and researchers. She was ready to take on the role of a liaison and coordinator, connecting her friends with the necessary experts and arranging consultations. Her analytical mind helped her assess all aspects of the task and prepare for future challenges. Dan, flipping through old documents found in the room, recalled moments when he felt closest to solving the mystery. His curiosity and passion for investigation made him an invaluable member of the team. He scrutinized each document with particular care, searching for clues and connections that could help unravel all the details of the puzzle. All four friends felt that this moment when they were so close to solving the mystery was critically important. Their unique approaches and characters complemented each other, creating a unified and strong team ready for new challenges the next day. Chapter 11: Nightly Scream. The friends stared at the ceiling of their rooms, engrossed in the book each had recently read, each immersed in their own thoughts about the mysteries of the house. Sleep did not come easy to them, as if the night itself held secrets and closely watched over them. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the silence was abruptly shattered by a horrifying, piercing scream echoing from deep within the forest outside their window. It was a sound that disturbed, more resembling a cry of desperation than a natural sound. All four friends woke up simultaneously, their hearts racing, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They looked at each other, eyes filled with anxiety and worry. Without a word, they jumped out of their beds and rushed into the hallway. There, in the corridor, they collided, as if comrades in arms ready for battle. Their gazes met in silent agreement of the need to find out what was happening beyond the walls of this house. in the darkness of the forest where something or someone was emitting such terrifying sounds. "It can't be just an animal," Max said, slightly out of breath after the rush. "Yeah, it's something else," Emily agreed, smoothing her hair and nervously glancing into the darkness outside the window. Dan, deep in thought, added, "We need to figure out what that sound is and where it's coming from." Kate, still tense with anticipation, nodded, fists clenched. "Let's be cautious and figure this out together." They were prepared for whatever might come next, knowing that the night was only beginning to reveal its secrets, and the mystery of this house remained unsolved. The friends stood in the hallway, tense and discussing their next steps after the horrifying scream emanating from the forest. Tension was palpable as each of them sought to express their point of view. "We need to find out what that sound is," immediately insisted Max, clenching his fists. "If we wait until morning, we might miss crucial clues." "But we don't know what could be out there," Emily countered, looking at her friends with a worried expression. "It could be dangerous to venture into the forest at this time of night." "I agree with Emily," added Dan, trying to keep calm. "We should stay safe and wait until morning to assess the situation in daylight." Kate listened silently to the arguments hanging in the air. Her face showed determination and focus. "We could go into the forest, but be prepared for anything. We need to act swiftly." In the end, they reached a compromise. Two of them would venture into the forest to investigate the source of the sound, while the other two would stay home, safe and await daylight. With nerves on edge, they prepared for the unknown, knowing that the decision they had made could impact the outcome of their entire adventure. The friends remained in the hallway, discussing what to do next after the terrifying scream from the forest. Max and Dan insisted on going into the woods to find the source of the sound, while Emily and Kate preferred to stay in the house until morning. But as soon as Max and Dan stepped outside, the sound abruptly stopped. Instead, a bright, inexplicable light suddenly flashed above the forest. It was so intense that it illuminated everything around, as if midday had come for a moment. The friends froze, frightened and stunned by the unexpected phenomenon. Their hearts pounded faster with excitement. All four looked at each other, questioning and terrified, assessing what was happening. "What was that?" Kate whispered, her eyes reflecting the glow of astonishment. "I've never seen anything like it," Dan replied, trying to make sense of what had happened. "Maybe it's some kind of artifact or technology," Emily suggested, bolstering herself with her words. Max nodded firmly. "We need to figure this out. It might be the key to the whole mystery." Struggling to contain their excitement, the friends gathered together, ready to explore this new turn of events. They all knew that their adventure was just beginning, and this unexpected flash of light could be crucial to the outcome of their investigation. I'm sorry for the confusion earlier. Here's the translation of Chapter 14 into English. After the sudden burst of light above the forest, the friends returned to the house to discuss what had happened. They gathered in the living room, sitting around the fireplace, which crackled softly, filling the room with warmth. "That was so strange," Kate began, looking at her friends. "What do you think it could have been?" "Maybe it was some natural phenomenon or technology," Dan suggested, gazing into the fireplace. "But where did such a bright light come from in the middle of the night?" Emily pondered aloud. Max, leaning towards a scientific approach, added, "Perhaps it was some experimental technology or even a school project." The conversation quieted as they all began to realize that nothing was clear. Their eyes wandered around the room as if searching for answers on the ceiling or walls. "I think we should go to sleep until morning," Kate suggested, sighing. "We're too tired, and we won't find out anything right now." The friends nodded in agreement, ready to put off further contemplation until morning. But as soon as they settled into their rooms, they heard strange rustling and unfamiliar sounds coming from the backyard. "Do you hear that?" Max whispered, straining to listen. "Yes, what could it be?" Emily asked, clutching her blanket. All four friends exchanged glances, their hearts beginning to beat a little faster. They knew their adventure in this mysterious house was far from over. The friends exchanged tense glances as they stood by the window, listening to unnatural sounds coming from the backyard. In the darkness, their figures looked tense and determined, ready for whatever might unfold. "What could it be?" Emily whispered, pressing against the window frame and trying to make out something in the darkness. "Maybe it's an animal or something else," Dan speculated, straining to hear and identify the sounds. Max, collecting his thoughts, added, "We need to find out what's happening. We can't stay in the dark about this." Their hearts beat faster as they approached the door and stepped outside. The moonlight illuminated the yard, casting shadows from the surrounding trees, and an eerie silence filled the atmosphere, interrupted only by occasional rustling sounds through the leaves. Chapter 3: Unexpected Discovery. The friends looked around the yard when suddenly loud metallic scraping sounds came from around the corner of the house. Their hearts raced as they rushed toward the source of the noise. Approaching the corner of the house, they discovered their own car, half buried in bushes. The front bumper was heavily dented, as if the car had collided with something. One of the headlights was shattered, with shards of glass scattered over the hood, which appeared as if someone had forcefully tried to pry it open. Several more dents marred the rear of the vehicle, and the roof was coated with a thick layer of dirt and leaves. "Wow, what happened to our car?" Max whispered, stunned by the extent of the damage. "It's our car," exclaimed Emily, leaning toward Dan. "How could this happen?" "We haven't been outside," Dan pondered, inspecting the vehicle. The friends exchanged glances, their minds filled with questions. Various theories raced through their heads about what could have happened to their car in their absence. The friends stood by the car, examining the damage, when suddenly a bright flash of light burst from deep within the forest. They turned towards the source, their hearts skipping a beat from the unexpected fright, overwhelmed by dark premonitions. "What was that?" Emily exclaimed, squeezing Dan's hand tightly. Max fumbled for the car keys in his jacket pocket. "We need to get back to the house quickly," he suggested, his voice filled with apprehension. The friends fell silent, trying to muster resolve. Various thoughts and conjectures raced through their minds about what could have caused the flash of light. In a flurry of unease, they hurried back towards the house, each step accompanied by anxious thoughts. Once inside, they closed the door and pressed against the wall, their eyes fixed on the window where mystical flashes of light continued to illuminate the dark forest outside. "What the hell is going on out there?" Dan muttered, trying to gather his thoughts. "Should we call for help?" Emily suggested, her voice trembling with concern. Max nodded, pulling out his phone. "Yes, but let's try contacting someone local first," he said, dialing the emergency services number. They sat in tense anticipation, waiting for a response to their call, trying to make sense of what was happening beyond the walls of this mysterious house in the woods. Max, Emily, and Dan sat in the dimly lit living room, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of their phones. Each attempt to call for help resulted in the same unsettling message: no service. Dan cursed under his breath, frustration evident in his voice. "This doesn't make any sense. We had perfect reception earlier." Emily glanced nervously out the window, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows of the dense forest surrounding them. Maybe it's the weather, or some kind of interference. She tried to sound calm, but her voice betrayed her growing unease. Max paced the room, his mind racing with thoughts of what could be happening outside their isolated cabin. "Whatever it is, we need to figure it out fast. We can't stay here without a way to contact anyone." As they deliberated their next move, a sudden chill filled the room, causing them all to shiver involuntarily. The atmosphere seemed to thicken with each passing moment, as if some unseen presence was watching them from the darkness beyond. "We should search the house," Emily suggested, her voice trembling slightly. "There might be something here that can help us. Tools, a radio, anything." Dan nodded in agreement, though his eyes remained fixed on the window. "Let's split up and check every room. We need to find out what's going on." With a shared sense of urgency, they dispersed into the cabin, their footsteps echoing softly on the creaky floorboards. Every corner they turned seemed to hold a new mystery, each room casting long shadows that danced ominously in the flickering candlelight. As they searched, their whispered conversations were punctuated by nervous glances and the occasional sound of something creaking in the distance. The house felt alive with secrets, its walls whispering tales of forgotten histories and lurking dangers. Outside, the forest loomed silently, its towering trees casting eerie silhouettes against the darkening sky. The air was thick with an unspoken dread, as if the very landscape held its breath, waiting for the next twist in their unsettling journey. The morning light began to seep through the windows as the three friends inadvertently lost track of time while exploring the house. They gathered in the old living room, enveloped by an eerie silence broken only by the creaks of the floorboards beneath their feet. Max stared out the window, his gaze fixated on the distant trees that seemed to whisper their secrets in hushed tones. We need to figure out what's going on. This place feels more peculiar by the minute. And what about our car? Dan sighed heavily, his hands trembling from nervous tension. It was our only link to the outside world. And who or what was that we saw in the forest? Emily glanced at her friends, her voice barely audible in the flickering dawn light. I feel like there's something very unusual happening here. Tension mounted in the room, each of them sensing unseen forces at play, instilling fear and apprehension. Perhaps we should search the house again. Max looked at his friends, his voice resolute. We might find something that will help us unravel this mystery. Dan nodded, though fear was evident in his eyes. Let's proceed cautiously and stick together. We don't know what we might encounter. Once more they dispersed through the rooms, meticulously and carefully inspecting every corner of the house. Meanwhile, the sun rose higher above the horizon, casting light into the interior, illuminating ancient artifacts and casting disorganized shadows. Every rustle, every creak of the floorboards prompted an immediate reaction. Tension grew with each passing second. Outside the window, the forest remained calm, yet their eyes remained fixed on its dark depths, anticipating the next sign of the mysterious presence. As they discussed everything happening, they heard a conversation outside in the yard. Gathering themselves, they stepped outside and saw a dark silhouette retreating down the road away from their house. The figure was clad in a black cloak and paid no heed to their cries and pleas to stop. Stop! Who are you? What are you doing here? Max shouted, trying to catch up with the stranger. They rushed forward, but something strange prevented them from getting closer. Each step seemed futile, as with every passing second, the mysterious figure moved farther and farther away. They ran, yet they couldn't catch up. He walked faster than they could have imagined. What was that? Who was that person? Emily asked, breathing heavily from both excitement and exertion. I don't know. It was so strange. Why didn't he acknowledge us? And why couldn't we catch him? Dan replied vaguely, looking back once more in the direction where the enigmatic figure had stood. They returned to the house, hearts pounding in unison, silent as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. Exhausted by everything that had happened, the friends decided to close themselves in the house and finally rest. They dragged their beds into the common room, barricaded all the doors, and lit the fireplace. The fire crackled cozily, creating an illusion of warmth and safety. Lying on their beds, they began discussing what to do next. We can't go on like this, Dan began, looking at his friends. We need to come up with something, or we'll just go crazy. Max nodded, rubbing his temples. I agree. We have to figure out what's going on. But right now we have no car and no means of communication. Emily sighed. Maybe tomorrow morning we can walk to town and try to find help. It's not close, but we have no other choice. But what if something happens again tonight? Alex asked, glancing around. We don't know what to expect from this place. Dan frowned. We have to be ready for anything. By barricading the doors, we've at least increased our safety a bit. But let's agree if something happens, we gather in this room immediately. And then what? Emily asked. Just sit and wait. No, Max replied, staring at the fire. We need to act. If nothing changes by morning, we go to town. Maybe there we'll find some answers. Emily looked at each of them. I don't want to go through that horror again. But we must stick together, no matter what. They nodded in agreement. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of the wind outside the window. Tired and worn out, they slowly drifted into a restless sleep, preparing for the next day, filled with uncertainty and fear. After the friends woke up around 4 in the afternoon, they realized that night was approaching again, and they needed to prepare for defense. The first thing they did was check the barricades and windows. Although nothing had happened during the day, they still felt uneasy. Every creaking window and vibrating board made their hearts skip a beat. Checking the barricades and morning rituals. Alex was the first to get up and start inspecting the house, checking the barricades. Max followed him, carefully examining every nail and board securing the doors and windows. The barricades they had built during the night were still holding, but needed some improvements. Max suggested reinforcing them even more, and the others agreed. "We need to make sure everything is secure," Max said. "Better safe than sorry." Claire and Sarah started preparing food. They found some canned goods and pasta in the pantry and decided to cook them. The dinner was simple but nourishing. They all gathered at the table in the common room and began discussing the events of the previous night. Discussing a plan of action. "We can't just sit around and wait for something to happen again," Alex began, breaking a piece of bread. "We need to be ready for anything." "You're right," Max agreed. "But first, we need to arm ourselves. We need something to protect ourselves if anything happens at night." "But what can we arm ourselves with?" Claire asked. "We don't have any weapons." "We can make some," Max replied, standing up from the table. "We have tools and materials. I can show you how to make simple but effective weapons." Assigning roles and gathering materials. Max divided the friends into groups. Alex and Claire were tasked with searching the house and yard for suitable sticks and pipes. Sarah and Max went to the workshop to find tools and other useful items. The house and yard were rich in materials. Alex and Claire found several sturdy wooden sticks and metal pipes. In the shed, they discovered old gardening tools that might come in handy. Meanwhile, Max and Sarah found hammers, nails, old knives, and other tools in the workshop. Creating weapons and defensive tools. Returning to the house, the friends began creating weapons. Max showed them how to sharpen the ends of wooden sticks, turning them into spears. He explained how to use hammers and knives to create other types of weapons. "We can make clubs from these pipes," Max said, demonstrating how to hold and use them properly. "And these stones will make excellent throwing weapons." Sarah and Claire took on the task of creating torches. They found some old cloth, which they soaked in flammable substances found in the shed. Max showed them how to securely fasten the cloth to the sticks, ensuring the torches were reliable and wouldn't go out at the wrong moment. Finding tools and materials. The process of making weapons took several hours. The friends worked diligently and quickly, understanding that time was not on their side. Each of them carried out their task with maximum responsibility. Alex and Claire searched every room in the house, finding old tools that might come in handy. They brought several hammers, nails, and even a couple of old rusty knives to the common room. Max found several heavy metal pipes in the shed that could be used as clubs. Through the crafting process. Max began by creating spears. He showed how to properly sharpen the ends of the sticks using knives and sharpening stones found in the house. Alex and Claire helped him, making the spears sharp and sturdy. Sarah and Max worked on creating torches using the old cloth and flammable materials. "These torches will help us not only light our way but also scare off any threats," Max said, demonstrating how to hold and use the torches. Reinforcing the barricades and creating additional defenses. Once the weapons were ready, the friends focused on reinforcing the barricades. They used the nails and hammers they found to strengthen the doors and windows. Max suggested building additional fences of sharp sticks around the house to create another level of defense. "These fences will prevent anyone from approaching us unnoticed," Max explained, hammering the final nails into the reinforcements. The mood and thoughts of the friends. Tension and fear filled the air. The friends understood that the night could bring unexpected and dangerous events. Each of them tried to support the others despite their own fears. "We did everything we could," Max said, trying to calm everyone down. "Now we just have to wait and be ready for anything." Nightfall. As night fell, the friends gathered in the common room, where they decided to spend the night. They arranged their beds and settled around the fireplace, keeping their weapons at the ready. The fireplace burned brightly, creating a cozy but tense atmosphere. Each of them listened intently for any sounds outside the windows, ready for anything that might happen. In the quiet of the night, they shared their thoughts and fears, trying to find solace in each other's company. "I can't believe all this is happening to us," Claire said, shivering from fear and cold. "It all feels like a nightmare." "But we'll get through this," Alex replied confidently. "We're together, and that's what matters." The night promised to be long and full of uncertainty. The friends were ready for anything that might happen and tried to support each other despite all the difficulties. Chapter 4. Night had fallen upon the house, shrouded in anxiety and fear. The friends, gathered in the common room, exchanged nervous glances, anticipating something inevitable and dangerous. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement in the dim light. They lay on their beds, trying to keep their makeshift weapons within reach, and attempted to sleep. However, sleep eluded them, and each of them battled internal demons, trying to calm their restless minds. The first hours passed relatively quietly. Only the sound of the wind outside the windows and the crackling of the logs in the fireplace broke the silence. Suddenly, around midnight, Alex woke up abruptly from a strange noise that resembled a quiet whisper. He sat up in bed and listened. The whisper grew louder, and Alex could make out the words. They sounded like an old, forgotten prayer in a language unknown to him. Alex looked at his friends. Everyone was sound asleep, except for Max, who was sitting by the window, attentively listening to the night. Alex approached him and whispered, "Do you hear that too?" Max nodded, not taking his eyes off the window. "What could it be?" Alex continued, glancing around. "I don't know, but I have a bad feeling," Max replied. "Let's wake the others." They quietly woke Claire and Sarah, who also began to listen to the whisper. Gradually, the whisper filled the room, and the friends felt a chill run down their spines. The whisper grew louder, and the words seemed understandable, but their meaning eluded them. Suddenly, the whisper stopped, and the room was enveloped in deafening silence. The friends looked at each other, not understanding what it was. Suddenly, the door to the room slowly opened, creaking on its old hinges. A figure in a black cloak stood on the threshold, its face hidden by the deep shadow of the hood. "Who are you?" Alex shouted, raising his makeshift spear. The figure did not answer and slowly moved towards the fireplace. The fire in the fireplace began to crackle louder, and then suddenly went out, leaving the room in complete darkness. The friends felt an icy cold emanating from the figure, and they caught their breath. "What do you want?" Claire shouted, trying to hide behind the bed. The figure stopped at the extinguished fireplace and raised its hand. At that moment, the fireplace flared up again, but the fire was an unusual blue color. It illuminated the room with a strange, ominous light. The figure slowly turned to the friends, and at that moment they felt an incredible heaviness, as if the air had become thick and it was hard to breathe. Max, gathering all his courage, rushed at the figure with his spear. But as soon as he got close, the figure dissolved into thin air, leaving behind only a faint smell of burning. The fire in the fireplace returned to its normal color, and the room filled with warmth. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Max replied, lowering his spear. "But we need to stay alert. This place is clearly not what it seems." They returned to their beds, trying not to fall asleep again, but fear and fatigue were taking their toll. Some time passed in silence, with only the fire in the fireplace quietly crackling. The second incident occurred around 2 in the morning. Sarah was sitting by the window, trying to calm herself, when she suddenly noticed movement outside. A shadow flitted through the garden, and she called the others. They all approached the window and saw the shadow moving among the trees. "What could that be?" Claire whispered, feeling panic rising within her. "We need to check," Alex said firmly. "We can't just sit and wait for this thing to come for us." The friends grabbed their weapons and cautiously went outside. The shadow stopped at the edge of the forest and seemed to be waiting for them. As they got closer, they saw that it was the same figure in the black cloak as in the house. "It's it again," Max whispered. "We have to be careful." They moved forward, but the figure began to retreat, slowly moving away from them. The friends tried to catch up, but the faster they ran, the further the figure went, as if playing with them. Suddenly, the shadow stopped and raised its hand, just as it had done in the house. A piercing scream echoed from the forest, and the figure vanished into thin air. The friends stopped, breathing heavily. The scream continued, seemingly coming from the depths of the forest. They looked at each other, not knowing what to do. "We need to get back to the house," Alex suggested. "It's not safe out here." They hurried back, and as they returned to the house, the scream died away. Once inside, the friends barricaded the doors again and gathered by the fireplace. They were frightened and confused. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Why is it haunting us?" "I don't know," Max replied. "But this place is clearly not what it seems. We need to be prepared for any danger." The night continued, and the friends tried not to sleep, feeling that something else was bound to happen. The final incident occurred close to dawn. Claire was sitting by the fireplace when she suddenly noticed the fire flickering strangely. The flames grew larger and smaller, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Something's wrong with the fire," she said, turning to her friends. They approached and saw strange images beginning to appear in the flames. At first they were just silhouettes, but then they became more defined. The friends saw faces of people, distorted in agony, as if they were trying to escape the flames. "This is a nightmare," Alex whispered, not believing his eyes. One of the images became particularly clear. It was a woman with long black hair and empty eyes. She reached out to the friends, as if pleading for help. Suddenly, the fire flared up brightly, and the images vanished. The friends stepped back, stunned by what they had seen. They looked at each other, not knowing what to say. "This place is cursed," Max finally said. "We need to get out of here as soon as possible." The dawn began to break through the windows, lighting the room with the first rays of light. The friends knew that the night had been filled with horrors, but they had survived. Now they had to decide what to do next and how to escape this nightmare. With the first rays of dawn, the friends gathered in the living room, exhausted and worn out by the night's events. Sleep eluded them that night, replaced only by fear and confusion. They decided not to go to bed but to head towards the town right away, hoping to find help and answers. After briefly discussing their plan of action, they began gathering supplies and weapons. Max, who had survival skills, quickly organized the collection of necessary items. They took everything that could be useful on the way: food, water, flashlights, blankets, and of course makeshift weapons made from available materials. Their backpacks contained knives, sturdy sticks, a few glass bottles with flammable liquid, and lighters. After leaving the house, the friends began their journey towards the nearest town, about 20 miles away. The forest surrounding them from the first steps seemed alive. Every rustle and crack of a branch made them look around, nervously listening to the sounds of nature. The first incident happened almost immediately after they left. They hadn't walked even half a mile from the house when they heard a noise behind them. Turning around, they saw a strange figure approaching them from the forest. It moved quickly, but without an obvious intention to catch up with them. The friends quickened their pace, and the figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. "This is just the beginning," muttered Alex, gripping a knife in his hands. A couple of hours later, they came across an old, overgrown bridge. It looked flimsy, but there were no other options to cross the river. Max, taking on the role of leader, was the first to step onto the bridge, testing its strength. The bridge creaked and swayed but held their weight. Max carefully stepped onto the first plank of the bridge. It creaked plaintively but held his weight. He took a few more steps, watching each plank closely. The bridge was covered in moss and rot, and every step was dangerous. Clara, standing on the shore, watched his progress tensely, clutching her backpack tightly. "Come on, but be careful," Max said quietly, turning to the others. Clara was the first to follow him, trying to step on the same planks as him. Her heart pounded wildly when the bridge creaked under her weight. At one point, one of the planks under her foot cracked, and she barely maintained her balance by grabbing onto Max. "It's okay," Max reassured her, holding her hand firmly. Claire and Alex followed them, trying to move as carefully as possible. Alex felt one of the planks under him begin to bend and froze. He slowly shifted his weight to the other foot and continued moving. When they finally reached the other side, Everyone felt relieved, but the tension did not leave them. As they walked through dense thickets, the friends noticed that the surrounding nature began to change. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining so tightly that light barely penetrated through the foliage. Suddenly, a howl, reminiscent of a wolf's but deeper and more eerie, came from the depths of the forest. The friends froze, listening. "We need to keep moving," Sarah said, trying not to show fear. As they moved forward, they began to notice strange symbols carved into the trees. They resembled the ones they had seen on the tombstone in the basement of the house. This increased their anxiety, but there was no turning back. Around noon, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned forester's cabin. The door was ajar, and despite their fear, the friends decided to peek inside, hoping to find something useful. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit. The only beam of light coming through a small window illuminated the dusty wooden floors and old furniture covered with a thick layer of dust. Old photographs hung on the walls, depicting people in early 20th century clothing. In one of the photos, the friends recognized the woman who they thought owned the house where they were staying. "It's her," exclaimed Claire, pointing to the photograph. "She lived here." Max approached and took the photograph in his hands. "This is strange. Could she really be connected to this place?" They continued to explore the cabin and found several old maps of the area that could be useful, as well as some canned food and a flask of water. Max also found a hunting knife, which he took for himself. When they continued their journey, a strong wind suddenly blew, swaying the trees and making them crouch. Suddenly, Alex noticed a bright light flickering in the distance among the trees. It looked like a signal, but when they approached, the light disappeared, leaving them even more puzzled. Throughout the day, the friends lost their bearings several times. The forest seemed to intentionally lead them in circles. At one point, they even returned to the same bridge they had already crossed. From this, they realized that someone or something was trying to mislead them. "This forest is alive," Max began, throwing dry branches into the fire. "It's playing with us." "But why?" asked Claire, glancing at the dark silhouettes of the trees. "Why won't it let us leave?" "Maybe this place is really cursed," suggested Sarah, shivering from the cold and fear. "All these symbols, the figure in the cloak, the strange sounds." "We must be strong," said Alex, trying to instill confidence in the others. "Tomorrow at dawn, we'll try to reach the town again. We must have a chance." The discussion continued until the fire burned down to embers. Each shared their thoughts and fears, but they all understood one thing: they had to stick together and be ready for anything. After a while, they lay down to sleep, but their rest was restless and troubled. The night brought new fears and nightmares, but the friends knew that their own salvation was in their hands. The morning was supposed to bring new challenges, but also new hopes. Chapter 5. Around 2 in the morning, Max, who had stayed on watch, sat by the campfire, half watching the smoldering embers. His friends were sleeping, wrapped in blankets, each trying to find some peace after the harrowing events. The forest around them was quiet, too quiet, which made Max uneasy. He couldn't let his guard down, knowing that danger could strike at any moment. Suddenly, Max noticed a dim light flickering through the trees. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, playing tricks on him due to his exhaustion. But the light didn't go away. It flickered like a beacon, beckoning him in the darkness. Max couldn't take his eyes off it. It felt like the light was calling to him, pulling him in. Careful not to wake the others, Max stood up. He took one last look at his friends, peacefully sleeping by the fire, and grabbing his flashlight, slowly made his way toward the glowing object. His steps were silent, but each heartbeat echoed loudly in his ears. As he walked between the trees, Max felt the tension in his body increasing. The forest around him seemed alive, every branch, every leaf watching him. The light ahead grew brighter, and Max quickened his pace, forgetting his caution. He was drawn to this mysterious flame in the darkness, like a moth to a flame. Suddenly, the light began to move, heading deeper into the forest. Max followed it without hesitation, as if he were hypnotized. He felt that the light knew the way, that it would lead him to the answers to all the mysteries of this place. When Max got closer, he saw that the light came from an old lantern swinging in the wind. Strange, since there was no wind. This seemed even more mysterious to Max. But he didn't stop, continuing to move forward. Around the lantern, he noticed something like a circle made of stones. Each stone was carved with the same symbols they had seen on the gravestone and trees. Max stopped at the edge of the circle, hesitating to step over its boundary. He felt a growing fear inside him, but curiosity was stronger. Suddenly, the light began to flicker and change. From the center of the circle, a misty figure rose and Max stepped back, gripping his flashlight tightly. The figure became clearer, and Max saw the ghostly image of a woman. It was the same woman from the photograph in the abandoned house. Her eyes glowed with a cold light, and her lips moved, speaking words in an unknown language. Max felt a chill envelop him. He couldn't move, couldn't take his eyes off the ghost in front of him. The woman raised her hand and pointed at him, and at that moment Max felt an invisible force pushing him forward, making him step over the stone circle. As soon as he was inside the circle, he was overwhelmed by a sense of complete loneliness and terror. Shadows swirled around him, trying to drag him into the darkness. Max tried to fight, but his strength was leaving him. He heard whispers growing louder, turning into screams. His body felt paralyzed, and he couldn't move. The light from the lantern became brighter, blinding him. Suddenly, everything around him plunged into total darkness, and Max felt something cold touch his skin. It was like the touch of ice, penetrating to the bone. Max screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening silence. In the next moment, he felt his body begin to fall, sinking into an abyss. The last thing he saw was the ghostly figure of the woman leaning over him, her eyes filled with silent horror. And then everything abruptly stopped. Early in the morning, at dawn, the entire company woke up to the cold and silence that hung over the forest. The fire had almost died out, leaving only smoldering embers. At first, no one noticed that Max was missing. But when Julia got up to wake the others, she realized that someone was missing. "Where's Max?" Her voice sounded like thunder in the silence. The guys began to look around, waking up from sleep, and the realization that Max was gone quickly took hold of them. "Max!" Tom shouted, jumping to his feet. "Max, where are you?" Panic began to rise as their cries went unanswered. Tom and Julia ran around the camp, peeking behind trees, checking all the hiding places, but Max was nowhere to be found. "Damn, what's going on here?" Sarah cursed, wrapping her arms around herself in fear and cold. "How could he just disappear?" "He wouldn't have gone far without us," Tom argued. "Something happened. We have to find him." But instead of acting rationally, an argument started. Everyone had their own assumptions and fears, which turned into mutual accusations. "This was all your idea, Tom. If it wasn't for you, we'd be at home right now," Sarah shouted, her eyes full of tears. "My idea?" "We all agreed to this," Tom replied, unable to contain his anger. "Do you think I want Max to disappear?" "Enough," Julia intervened, her voice trembling with tension. "Now is not the time for arguments. We need to do something." "And what do you suggest?" Sarah asked sarcastically. "We need to find him." "Together," Julia replied firmly. "But first, we need to calm down and think." Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She turned abruptly and ran into the forest, shouting Max's name. "Sarah, come back!" Tom and Julia shouted, but it was too late. Sarah disappeared among the trees. Left alone, Tom and Julia tried to get their thoughts in order. They realized that panic and disagreements only worsened the situation. "We need to stay calm," Tom said, taking a deep breath. "If we act together, we have a better chance of finding both of them." "Agreed," Julia nodded. "But what do we do? We can't just wander through the forest." "Maybe Max left some tracks. Let's check the place where we camped. Maybe we'll find something that will help us understand where he went." They began to carefully examine the camp, trying not to miss any details. Tom found footprints leading from the camp into the depths of the forest. Julia picked up Max's flashlight, which he had apparently dropped when he left. "It looks like he went that way," Tom pointed to the tracks. "But why? What could have drawn him into the forest at night?" "I don't know," Julia replied. "But we have no choice. We have to follow him." "Sarah also went in that direction," Tom added, looking back at the forest. "Let's try to catch up with her. It will be safer together." When they realized that the tracks led to the same place, their hearts tightened with anxiety. They began to move faster, carefully making their way through the dense forest. Julia and Tom watched every detail, hoping to find at least some trace of their friends. Suddenly, Julia stopped. "Wait, Sarah is nowhere to be seen. She should have been here." They shouted in unison, calling for Sarah. But the only answer was the deafening silence of the forest. Both friends' hearts tightened with fear. They realized that the situation was becoming even more frightening. "Sarah," Tom shouted again, unable to believe his eyes. "Sarah, where are you?" "We can't stay here," Julia said, panic gradually taking over her. "We need to find them. They couldn't have gone far." Tom nodded, but his eyes showed the same anxiety as Julia's. Together they continued their way into the depths of the forest, hoping to find their friends before it was too late. As Tom and Julia ventured deeper into the forest, they soon realized they were completely lost. The thick canopy of trees overhead blocked almost all the light, casting long shadows that seemed like living creatures. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by their footsteps and the occasional snap of a branch. "We need to find shelter before it gets dark," Tom said, his voice tinged with desperation. "We can't stay out in the open." Julia nodded in agreement, her eyes scanning for any place they could take refuge. They walked in silence, which seemed like an eternity, feeling the weight of their situation. Just as they were about to lose hope, Julia spotted an opening in the rock face. "Tom, look, a cave," she exclaimed, pointing to the dark entrance partially hidden by thick vegetation. They cautiously approached the cave, peering into the darkness. The entrance was narrow but gradually widened, disappearing into the black void. "It's not ideal, but it's the best we have," Tom said, glancing at Julia. "We can start a fire and take turns keeping watch." They gathered dry branches and leaves, starting a small fire at the cave entrance. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating a sense of both comfort and unease. Exhausted, they settled on the cold, damp stone. "I'll take the first watch," Tom offered, seeing the fatigue in Julia's eyes. "Get some rest." Julia nodded, lying down on the makeshift bed of leaves they had prepared. Despite the fear and uncertainty gnawing at her, exhaustion quickly took over, and she drifted into a restless sleep. Tom sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to stay alert. The sounds of the night began to close in around him, with the occasional rustle or distant animal cry sending shivers down his spine. Just as he started to relax, a low growl echoed from the depths of the cave. Tom jumped to his feet, his heart racing. He shone his flashlight into the darkness, trying to see the source of the sound but saw nothing. The growl came again, closer this time, and Tom felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He carefully woke Julia, covering her mouth with his hand to prevent her from screaming. She opened her eyes and immediately sensed something was wrong. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Shh," Tom whispered back. "I heard something deep in the cave." They froze, listening to the sounds around them. Suddenly, a creature leaped out of the darkness, and they saw it in full. It was a wolf, but not an ordinary one. Its snow-white fur glistened in the firelight, and its eyes burned a bright red. Parts of its body were decayed, emitting a foul stench of rot. Shadows seemed to envelop it, making it even more terrifying. Tom lunged for the fire, grabbing the nearest stick and taking a defensive stance, shielding Julia. The wolf slowly approached, growling and baring its razor-sharp teeth. Julia, quickly gathering her wits, grabbed another stick and stood beside Tom. The first clash happened swiftly. The wolf lunged at them with incredible speed, and Tom barely managed to lift the stick to deflect the attack. The wolf's jaws clamped down on the wood, and Tom felt the full force of the strike as the beast pushed off the stick and jumped back. Julia seized the moment, trying to strike the wolf from the side, but it deftly dodged, and her stick only grazed its flank. The wolf howled in rage and leaped at Tom again. Tom felt powerful paws knock him to the ground, and in the next moment he was on his back, trying to keep the beast's jaws away from his face. Julia, not wasting a second, grabbed a rock and smashed it against the wolf's head with all her might. The creature howled and retreated for a moment, allowing Tom to scramble to his feet. Now they both stood, breathing heavily, facing the monstrous adversary. The wolf, enraged and wounded, began circling them, looking for an opening to attack again. Tom and Julia stood back to back, ready for another confrontation. Each of the wolf's steps was slow and deliberate, as if it was studying their weaknesses. Suddenly the wolf lunged at them again, but this time they were prepared. Tom managed to strike it in the face with his stick, and Julia, jumping up, landed a blow on its side. The wolf snarled in pain but continued its assault. For several more minutes they exchanged blows, sticks breaking under the onslaught of teeth and claws, their bodies covered with more and more scratches. Every move of the wolf was swift and deadly. Its claws slashed through the air, leaving deep marks on the ground. Tom and Julia, despite their fatigue, held their ground. Their strikes became more accurate, and each time the wolf tried to reach them, they managed to fend off the attack. At one point, Tom felt one of the wolf's claws dig deep into his side. He cried out in pain but did not stop. Adrenaline drove him forward, helping him ignore the wound. Julia, seeing his suffering, redoubled her efforts, raining blows on the wolf. Their battle continued, seemingly forever. Finally, when their strength was nearly gone, they managed to inflict several serious wounds on the wolf. The beast howled in pain and, stumbling, retreated. Its red eyes briefly met theirs, full of hatred and rage, before the wolf turned and disappeared into the darkness of the cave. Tom and Julia stood there, breathing heavily and examining each other for injuries. Julia was the first to break the silence. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. "Looks like just a scratch," Tom replied, trying not to show how much it hurt. They returned to the fire, shivering from the terror they had experienced, and sat, unable to sleep, until dawn. Chapter 6. Tom and Julia sat by the fire, exhausted and worn out, staring into the darkness with trepidation and fear. Their eyes constantly scanned the perimeter of the camp, catching every rustle and shadow, ready for the next attack by the forest's horrors. As the first rays of the sun began to break through the tree canopies, Julia started packing their things, preparing to move out. Tom, feeling the throbbing pain in his leg, stepped aside to check his wound. He carefully lifted his pant leg, revealing a horrifying sight. The skin was torn, blood had crusted around deep cuts, and the muscle tissue looked inflamed and swollen. The sight of his leg made him nauseous, but he decided not to tell Julia, pretending everything was fine. "Is everything all right?" Julia asked, noticing his strange expression. "Yeah, it just hurts a little," he lied, pulling his pant leg back down. "We need to keep moving." They gathered their things and began walking through the forest, trying not to lose their way. The forest surrounded them with a dense wall of trees and bushes, their footsteps muffled by the soft carpet of leaves and needles. Tom tried not to limp, so as not to draw Julia's attention to his wound. "What do you think that creature was?" Julia asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know," Tom replied, trying to mask the pain in his voice. "But whatever it was, we need to find the others and get out of here." With each passing mile, Tom felt his strength leaving him. He tried not to show it to Julia, but each step became increasingly difficult. The forest grew thicker, branches and vines snagging their clothes, hindering their progress. Birds occasionally let out piercing cries, reminding them they were not alone in this forest. "Let's stop for a minute," Julia suggested, seeing Tom starting to lag behind. "We need a little rest." Tom nodded and sat on a fallen tree, trying not to show how much it hurt. Julia took out a flask of water and handed it to him. He gratefully accepted it, taking a few sips. "What do you think happened to them?" Julia asked, looking into the depths of the forest. "I hope they're okay," Tom replied. "We need to find them as soon as possible." They moved on again, trying not to waste any time. The forest seemed endless, and each new turn brought new challenges. Tree roots protruding from the ground made them stumble, and dense shrubs blocked their way. But they kept going, not stopping. "Look, there's something there," Julia said, pointing ahead. Tom looked in the indicated direction and saw something that looked like an old, abandoned cabin. They approached it, carefully making their way through the thickets. The cabin was in a deplorable state. The roof had collapsed, the walls were covered in moss and mold, and the doors and windows were broken. "Maybe we'll find some clues here," Julia suggested, looking around. "It's worth checking out," Tom agreed. They entered the cabin, carefully stepping on the rotting boards. Inside, it smelled of dampness and decay. Old, tattered pictures hung on the walls, and the floor was covered with a layer of dust and debris. In one corner, they found an old chest that seemed not to have been opened for many years. "Look, what's this?" Julia asked, pointing to the chest. Tom approached and cautiously opened it. Inside, they found old, moldy papers and several photographs. One of the photographs showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. They were all standing in front of this cabin, smiling at the camera. "Who could they be?" Julia asked thoughtfully, examining the photograph. "I have no idea," Tom replied, "but it might be important. Maybe these people lived here before." They continued to explore the cabin but found nothing else of interest. Returning outside, Tom suddenly heard a faint cry for help. He turned to Julia, and their eyes met. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Yes, from over there," she replied, pointing toward the dense forest. They ran in the direction of the sound, pushing through the thick vegetation. Soon, they came across a pit dug in the ground, where Sarah lay. Her leg was impaled on a stake, and she was screaming in pain. "Sarah," Julia screamed, rushing to the pit. "Hold on, we'll get you out of there." Tom and Julia carefully climbed into the pit, trying not to cause Sarah more pain. Tom grabbed one end of the stake and Julia the other, and they began to slowly pull it out of Sarah's leg. Each movement caused her unbearable pain, and she screamed, clenching her teeth. Finally, they managed to pull out the stake, and Tom pressed a piece of his shirt to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. They carefully lifted Sarah and carried her out of the pit, laying her on the ground. "We need to stop the bleeding," Tom said, taking out a first aid kit. "Julia, help me." They applied bandages to the wound and tied it tightly, trying to stop the bleeding. Sarah lay on the ground, breathing heavily, but it seemed the pain was starting to subside a little. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at her rescuers. "I thought I was going to die there." They lit a fire to warm up and prepare some food. Sarah, still breathing weakly, began to tell her story. "After we split up, I went looking for you," she began. "But the forest was so confusing, and I soon got lost. I walked, shouted, called for you, but no one answered. At night I found this place and decided to stay here, but suddenly I felt something was wrong. It was as if someone or something was watching me." She paused to take a sip of water. "And suddenly I saw this light. It was so bright it blinded me. I ran but didn't know where. And then I fell into this pit. I screamed, called for help, but no one came. I thought it was the end." Listening to Sarah's story, Tom and Julia exchanged anxious looks. The forest seemed even more sinister and unpredictable, and they knew they had to be prepared for any surprises. "We need to stick together," Tom said, looking at Julia and Sarah. "Only then can we survive and find a way out of this forest." They sat by the fire, listening to the night sounds of the forest, each lost in their thoughts. Was there hope for them to get out of here alive? They didn't know. But one thing was clear: they had to fight for their lives and not lose faith. That night it seemed everything around them had conspired against them. The darkness deepened, and every rustle in the forest echoed through their frayed nerves. Tom, Julia, and Sarah sat by the fire, trying with all their might to retain warmth and a sense of safety. The flames danced in the night, casting strange shadows on the surrounding trees. "I can't take it anymore," whispered Sarah, clutching her leg. Her face was pale with pain and fear. "These sounds, they're driving me crazy." Julia hugged her tightly by the shoulders, trying to comfort her friend. "We have to stick together. We'll get through this." But Julia's words were barely audible over the surrounding night. Suddenly, shadows began to appear from the darkness, moving as if alive. They encircled the camp, drawing closer and closer. "Tom, what is that?" Julia asked fearfully, looking at the dark figures. "I don't know, but we need to leave," Tom replied sharply. "Grab your things and run." They gathered their few belongings and ran, leaving the fire burning. The shadows chased them, becoming increasingly menacing. Eerie whispers echoed in the trees, and branches cracked underfoot, as if someone invisible was following them. Tom tried not to show how much pain he was in. Every step sent a sharp pain through his wound, but he knew he couldn't stop. "Faster," he shouted, trying not to lag behind the girls. Julia glanced back, seeing the shadows closing in on them. "What do we do, Tom?" "Forward. We need to find shelter," he shouted, pushing through the thick undergrowth. The forest around them grew darker, the branches reaching out like monstrous hands. Suddenly, a cave appeared before them. Its entrance was covered in ancient runes, glowing with a faint blue light. Julia was the first to notice the symbols. "Look, these runes, maybe they'll protect us." They ran inside the cave, and as soon as they crossed the threshold, an invisible barrier formed around the entrance. The shadows stopped as if hitting an invisible wall. They howled silently and writhed but couldn't enter. What the Tom turned, looking at the strange symbols. "These runes, they saved us." Sarah, trembling with fear and pain, sat on the ground. "Are we safe?" "It looks like it," Julia replied, sitting next to her. "At least for now." They looked around, trying to comprehend where they were. The cave stretched deep into the earth, its walls covered in strange symbols and drawings. The ancient signs glimmered as if guarding them. "What is this place?" Tom asked, examining the walls. "It looks like some kind of sanctuary." Julia nodded, her fingers lightly touching the symbols on the wall. "It seems these signs have been here a long time. Maybe they really are protecting us." The silence of the cave was deafening after the noise of the forest. Only the sound of their breathing and the dripping of water broke the silence. Suddenly, a faint whimpering came from the depths of the cave. "What is that?" Sarah tensed, listening to the sound. "I don't know," Tom replied, trying to discern the source. "But it seems like someone or something is here." They exchanged anxious glances, realizing that the night was far from over. The cave seemed to give them a respite, but its secrets could be just as dangerous as the forest outside. "We need to figure out what's going on here," Julia said resolutely. "But first, let's try to rest and gather our strength." They settled in a corner of the cave where it was warmer and safer. Wrapped in blankets, they listened intently to every sound, knowing that the night would bring new trials. The cave offered a rare moment of respite from the horrors outside. Tom, Julia, and Sarah settled down, their exhaustion evident in their faces and movements. The walls of the cave glowed faintly with the mysterious runes, providing a gentle light that made the space feel somewhat safe. "I still can't believe what we've been through," Tom said, wincing as he adjusted his bandage. "Me neither," Sarah agreed, her voice trembling. "It feels like a nightmare we can't wake up from." Julia nodded, her eyes scanning the cave's interior. "But we can't lose hope. We have to find a way out of this." Tom sighed, leaning back against the cool stone wall. "Do you think there's any chance we can still find Matt? Or what if he's already?" "Don't say it," Julia interrupted, her voice firm. "We can't think like that. Matt's strong. If anyone can survive out there, it's him." Sarah hugged her knees to her chest. "But what if he's hurt? What if he's hurt? What if he's waiting for us to find him and we're just wasting time hiding?" Julia reached over, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "We'll find him, Sarah. We just need to be smart about this." Tom nodded. "We need to rest and gather our strength. The runes seem to be protecting us here. We should take advantage of that." They fell into a heavy silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of their journey pressed down on them, the memories of their encounters flashing vividly in their minds. "I keep thinking about the wolf," Sarah whispered. "Those red eyes, the way it moved. It was like nothing I've ever seen. And the house, Julia added. What was that place? Why did it feel like it was alive? Tom rubbed his face with his hands. There are so many questions and no answers. It's driving me crazy. We'll find answers, Julia said with determination. But first, we need to survive. As the night wore on, they decided to take turns keeping watch. Julia took the first shift, her eyes heavy but her mind alert. Tom and Sarah quickly fell asleep, their breath slow and even in the quiet cave. Julia's mind wandered back to Matt. She remembered their last conversation, his confident smile, and the way he always seemed to know what to do. She couldn't lose him. Not now, not ever. A faint, almost imperceptible sound broke her thoughts. A soft whimper, like a small animal in distress. Julia's ears perked up, and she strained to hear it again. There it was, coming from deeper within the cave. Curiosity piqued. She stood up and carefully made her way towards the sound. She didn't want to wake Tom and Sarah, not yet. The whimpering grew louder, guiding her steps through the dimly lit cave. Behind a large rock, she found the source of the sound. A small, shivering puppy lay curled up, its eyes wide with fear. It had an unusual appearance. Its fur was a deep midnight blue, almost black, with specks of silver that glittered like stars. Its eyes were a striking emerald green, and its ears were slightly longer than normal, giving it an otherworldly look. Julia's heart melted at the sight. She gently scooped the puppy into her arms, whispering soothing words to calm it down. The puppy nuzzled into her, its tiny body trembling but gradually relaxing in her embrace. As she held the puppy, Julia's eyes caught a glimpse of something else. Beyond the rock, deeper into the cave, she saw the faint glow of torchlight. Narrow corridors stretched out, their walls lined with more of the glowing runes. It looked like a path leading further into the unknown depths of the cave. With the puppy secure in her arms, Julia quickly made her way back to Tom and Sarah. She shook them gently, waking them from their uneasy sleep. "Guys, wake up," she urged. "I found something." Tom groaned, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" Sarah blinked, still groggy. "Julia, what?" "Look," Julia interrupted, holding up the puppy. "I found this little guy. And there's more. There are corridors deeper in the cave, with torches and runes. We need to check it out." Tom and Sarah exchanged bewildered glances, then looked at the puppy in Julia's arms. "Where did you find it?" Tom asked, standing up and stretching. "Just a little further," and Julia replied. "There's a whole network of tunnels. It could be a way out, or it could lead to more answers." Sarah stood up, her interest piqued. "All right, let's go. But we need to be careful." Tom nodded, grabbing his makeshift weapon. "Lead the way, Julia." With the puppy nestled safely against her, Julia led her friends deeper into the cave, towards the mysterious corridors that seemed to hold the key to their survival and the answers they desperately sought.